Okay, well, welcome everybody, and nice to see you here, and a few people who've been on the calls, and a few new people who are popping on right now. And so this is for those of you who aren't familiar with the bridge and what we do. This is the bridge online, and usually we're doing these in person, but given the situation in the world right now, we've been moving our talks to an online format, which has been a really fun way of widening our community and connecting with a lot more people. And for those of you, who don't know, although looking at this call, I think most of you know, the bridge is based at Green School, where many of the parents on this call have have kids who are learning online right now. And Green School is a school that's focused on environmentalism and sustainability, and that's where the bridge is located. And the bridge is a unique platform that is Green School for grown-ups. It allows for the adult community to kind of have a way of engaging in talks and learning so that our kids don't get to have all of the fun. And over the past 2 years, we've run over 500 talks and programs and workshops. And so it's been a really interesting format for us over the past couple of years. So for tonight, if the group gets bigger, then sometimes we will kind of put questions just on the chat. But if we stay roughly this size to up to about 20 people, as we get to the end of Charlie's presentation, you can just use the reaction indicator, the hand indicator, to raise your hand, or just wave your hand if you're on video, and I'll see you. And so I'll be kind of moderating very casually by using the chat and observing the visual clues of what you are doing, as well as if you are doing something funny, walking away, or not muting or eating. And I will be keeping the mute kind of in control on people's video as well too. So tonight, for those of you who have never heard Charlie speak, Charlie is a really fascinating guy, and he is a documentary filmmaker. He has made a number of different films. He has been a speaker at the bridge at Green School before, and he just has a really amazing insight into the world of social issues and things that are happening within different countries and all sorts of different things. And so he is from Australia, and he has spent a huge amount of his life in Indonesia. And maybe he'll allude to some of the stuff that he's been doing there. And but he's just a really good guy, and we really enjoy him, and he's fun. And so we're really happy to be having Charlie on the call for tonight. So let's give Charlie a nice little round of applause and welcome him in.
Hey, everybody. Thanks, Chris. Thank you very much. Hi there, everyone. For those of you that don't know me, my name's Charlie Hill-Smith. I'm here in Bali with my partner, Cindy, and our kids, our little rascals, Jack and Ariel, who are Green School kids, and we're members of the Green School community. And that's how I got to meet this great gang of people at the bridge. And I want to do something new today, a new story for this new remote experience, this remote format in this post-apocalyptic wasteland Armageddon era that we're living in. For all of us, it's a strange ISO. Obviously, Australians put everything into tiny expressions, and isolation's just become known as ISO in Australia. So this strange ISO time that we're living in, locked away with our families, and it got me thinking about home, about Australia, about family, about missing home, and about Australia in general. So I want to tell a story today about history, about colonialism, about fascism, and about being Australian. And the long journey that's taken me to realise who I am and what my country is. I've called today's talk Motorkite Dreaming, the making of a post-colonial adventure documentary for Redbull TV, and the creation of my post-colonial identity as a white man from a black nation. A bit of a mouthful, slightly pretentious, I admit, but here we go. In 2016, I released a feature documentary and a TV series called Motorkite Dreaming. It's an extreme cultural adventure film that follows two young Australians as they fly tiny microlights, which are hang gliders with engines, 4,000 kilometres from the south of Australia to the far remote north of Australia, across 4 deserts and 20 Aboriginal language nations. It's a rockin' little film, and it was the culmination of 20 years of learning about my home and how I, as a white Australian, fit into that landscape. I'll get back to Motorkite Dreaming a bit later in this presentation. I've since worked out, slowly but surely, that I didn't become a documentary filmmaker by chance. I worked out pretty early in life that we humans are pretty much story machines, juiced up on chit chat, maxed out on gossip, rocket fueled by storytelling. This is how we create our realities. So in today's story, I'm going to use chapter headings to guide this pretty loose as a goose narrative and to try and keep us on track and paint a moving picture of the route that I've taken to gain a sense of identity. I'm a writer and a director and a producer. My last 2 feature documentaries, Motorkite Dreaming and Strangebirds in Paradise, played all around the world, and I was nominated for Best Director and Best Film by the Australian Academy Awards, the AFIs as they were known back in the day. I've now had almost 30 years experience as an artist, working as a cartoonist, an actor, a comedian, a writer, director of theatre, film and television. All of these mediums are storytelling mediums. And of course, in story, drama is king. This drama today begins with a very wide establishing shot, a shot of country, if you will. Specifically, the intersection of 2 giant countries, Australia and Indonesia. Neighbours, enemies, friends, foes, intimately linked by history and geography, separated by politics, by language, by culture, and a very, very thin piece of ocean. The first, my birthplace, the great desert continent of Australia, the biggest island on Earth, the driest, the least tectonic, the least populated, the most urbanised nation on Earth. The second, Indonesia, a teeming archipelago of large and tiny islands, about 16,500, humid, torrentially wet, tectonic rim of fire, the most volcanoes, earthquakes, the most densely populated, the most agrarian nation on Earth. 2 countries that couldn't be more different. Perfect. Drama and place. I love it. Okay. Identity in Australia is a complicated picture. We're a nation of migrants from every country on Earth. Wave after wave of migration from 1788. Even the Indigenous Aboriginal population have in large part been forced by invasion and government policies and economic necessity to migrate across the continent. So the question of who you are in Australia in terms of place and culture and where you call home is complicated. This, of course, is not unique to Australia. Many of us around the world understand these questions. It's a complicated world, and identity shifts like sand in wind, no matter where you're born. Franz Kafka once said that identity is like a cage looking for a bird. Very pictorial. But I feel also that as limiting as identity can be, it can also give you a sense of home, a grounding centre point to take on the difficulties that life is bound to throw at you. So let's dive into life. Chapter 1, 1983 to 1992, entitled Into the World, Education and Death. Dramatic. I finished high school in 1983. I was a big fish in a small pond, white, male, affluent, pretty sure of myself. I immediately applied for a student exchange program, 12 months of living in a foreign country. I was fairly Eurocentric child, and so I applied for France, Italy, Spain, and Greece, I think were the choices that I put down. They told me I was going to Indonesia, and I immediately said, Indo where? It wasn't really on my radar. But I was sent to Central Java, to Semarang, and I encountered a new language, a new culture, new food. I was totally out of my depth. For the first time in my life, I was a minority, and it was a tough and formative year of living with the Soweto family, a beautiful Central Javanese middle-class family, and their love and generosity built the bridge that allowed me to have a lifelong love affair with Indonesia. I returned to Australia after that incredible year, and no one really wanted to know anything about Indo-ware. It was not a topic of discussion or of interest to anybody except me, it seemed. But I was changed forever by the experience. In '86, I went to university, the Adelaide University. I did an arts degree, followed by a Bachelor of Business, and I began traveling around Australia, Europe, Asia, South and North America. And this really started to form a sense of a global, international identity, I guess. Then in 1991, out of the blue, to some degree, I guess, both my parents died within 12 months of each other. And to slightly misquote Oscar Wilde, to lose one parent is a tragedy, but to lose two just seems like carelessness. Suddenly, Alexandra and Johnny, these two generous, somewhat tragic people who had set me off on the great adventure of life with a heart full of respect for all colours and creeds, were gone. And it sent me spinning, feeling adrift, feeling untethered, unanchored, alone. I think primarily because I was unable to ask those important questions about life, about our family, about where we came from, about our place in the world and in this country. All those questions would never be answered by them. So now it was up to me to find those answers and perhaps to answer the biggest question, which the Greeks knew so well, that they actually carved it into the giant stone thighs of the Colossus of Rhodes. And as you sailed your ship into the harbour of Rhodes, you could look above at the carving in his huge stone loins that read, "Know thyself." Beautiful, elegant, simple, but timelessly complex. I think what I knew at the age of 21 was that Australia, this giant desert, bush, beach continent, was my home. I loved it. But my gene pool had evolved very far from here, and something was missing in this picture. Growing up in the country and the city, I could tell that something was wrong. I felt lost somehow in this beautiful, familiar, but somewhat unfamiliar landscape. A strange dream, a slightly lost feeling. And then it dawned on me in my later teens that what was really missing from this Eurofied Australian landscape was black people. The people who had humanized the continent from end to end, from sea to shining sea, the oldest living culture on earth, were invisible, completely invisible in this whitewashed middle-class perfection that was my childhood. In fact, when Europeans arrived in Australia in 1788, there were between 300,000 and 500,000 Aboriginal people living on the continent. And within 100 years, there were only 50,000 left alive. So how did this catastrophe occur? You know, what had happened here? My family sure didn't have the answers. So leads me to chapter 2, my family tree. The Smiths, who became the Hill Smiths, arrived in Australia in the 1840s. Samuel Smith, a brewer from Essex, became a gardener to a rich landowner, went to Ballarat in Victoria, found gold with his two sons, moved back to South Australia to the Barossa Valley, bought land and started a winery called Yalumba, which is now the oldest family-owned winery in Australia, in this beautiful, rich region of South Australia. My mother's family, the Forbeses, Alexander Forbes basically shot his way out of a Glasgow ghetto in the 1860s from poverty and crofting to become a physician, and ended up becoming a physician to Queen Victoria. And in the 1890s, moved his family to Australia. And my Forbes family went on to fight in every war that king and country could invent. They fought in the First World War, the Second World War, and in Korea. So I am the mix of old military stock and old white farmer stock. But what was now apparent to me was that we were an old white family in an ancient black land. I realized I needed now to journey into this black land to find out the big picture. And so my journey into Black Australia began. And that leads us to chapter 3, Into Black Australia. Growing up as a young man in Adelaide and in the Barossa Valley, I didn't know a single Aboriginal person. In fact, I met my first Aboriginal friends at university, aged about 20 years old. This was the level of invisibility of Aboriginal people and society. Australian history at high school was a joke. We were told that Australia had been peacefully settled. I grew up inside what is deemed the Great Australian Silence, a term that was coined by Australia's first and greatest anthropologist, W.H. Stanner. Stanner said the Great Australian Silence was a systematic suppression of national identity. Suppressed perhaps because a Christian nation couldn't psychologically deal with the truth of what it had actually done. Stanner also said that few national histories can have afforded a more blazing and odious rationalisation of ugly deeds. So I studied Australian history at Adelaide University. Right at the time, in the early 80s, that was the beginning of the great resurgence of Australian history. Australian historians were starting to uncover our suppressed history. Books like Henry Reynolds' Other Side of the Frontier blew the lid off this whitewashing. I started travelling into Black Australia to Aboriginal communities in northern South Australia and the Northern Territory with friends and connections. I started reading the great historians, Stanner, Reynolds, Elder, Ryan, John Pilger, later people like Bruce Pascoe, Stan Grant, and many others. And I started slowly figuring out what had occurred here in Australia. The questions were, was it murder? Was it disease? Was it genocide? Was it the inevitable outcome of migration and advancing technology? Or was the whole thing an avoidable crime, historical crime? We, my friends, my mates and I, as young Aussies, were simply not really equipped to begin to answer any of those questions. And it took me decades to fill in the gaps because there was no guide in the real world to navigate that landscape. Maybe if I'd stayed at uni for a bit longer, I might have cracked that nut a bit earlier. No doubt I would have. But I was an artist primarily, even in those young days. I was young and all I wanted to do was drink beer, meet girls, have adventures. And so that's what I did in that order. Chapter 4, Art, the Digital Disruption and Documentary. By the mid-90s, I just begun to realise that in order to know thyself, I had to work out what the hell my country, this colonial puzzle, was all about. The very big questions that I was posing myself, I was not really prepared or capable of answering. All I really knew was art and creativity. And so I became an actor, a comedian, and I did my best to travel as far and as wide as I could in Australia and around the world to explore all of these things, tragic and hilarious. Then in 1996, the world changed because Sony released the VX1000, a very cheap video camera that was good enough to be broadcast on television. Digital disruption had begun, and I jumped on board with a vengeance and bought this digital camera. And I shot my first documentary in 1997 called Hong Kong Phooey and the Great Chinese Takeaway. I didn't really know why, but I knew in my bones that the 97 Hong Kong handover was a very important event. So I planned up, saved a lot of money, and flew to Hong Kong in June of 97. The handover showed in pretty sharp relief the end of an old Western empire and the colonialism associated with that empire, and the rise of a new Eastern Chinese empire. It's a portrait of the events of the Hong Kong handover, and it's a portrait of China in the late 90s. Hong Kong Phooey and the Great Chinese Takeaway. I'll give you some links to these films later on at the very end of the presentation. The doco is a bit clunky. It's my first doco, but I worked really hard on it. I researched the living hell out of the Middle Kingdom, and I learned a lot about filmmaking in the process. And even now, 20 years later, I stand by its conclusions. In fact, I finished the film with a slightly twisted Shakespearean quote that says, "How long will Hong Kong's sweet life last? As long as heaven and nature lengthens it, or as long as Beijing likes it?" And we can all see right now that sure enough, Hong Kong finds itself knee-deep in Beijing's authoritarian bullshit, struggling to survive as the dinosaurs of the PLA and the Central Communist Party strangle the living hell out of that glorious little city-state. At that time, I had no idea that I was blindly stumbling into the intellectual and cultural landscape that would define all my films and all the art that I've done since. That is post-colonialism or post-colonial studies. Chapter 5 of this presentation is Australian comedy and white supremacy. Before I became a filmmaker, I was a stand-up comedian for many years and an improviser in comedy clubs in my hometown in Adelaide and in Melbourne and around Australia. It was a great way of telling stories and having a laugh, meeting people, meeting girls, and a great way to express yourself. In 1997, Australia elected a senator to the federal parliament of Australia called Pauline Hanson. She was an ex-fish and chip shop owner from Queensland and a hateful nationalist redneck politician that really brought out the worst and showed that ugly white Australia was still alive and very much kicking. When she decided to come to Adelaide to hold a rally, my comedian mates and I formed Comedians Against Racism to protest against National Action, who are a white supremacist group in South Australia. And for the occasion, I wrote a poem, an ode to Pauline Hanson called Get Back on the Grill. I performed the poem at the anti-fascist rally amongst a sea of skinheads and protected by my comedy mates. We were charged by the Nazis who attacked us in a classic Nazi pincer movement and were repelled by my comedian mates as I stood on a milk crate with a megaphone and belted out the poem. And I'll do the poem for you quickly here. A cup of tea. The poem's called Get Back on the Grill. It goes like this. Oh, herald the dawn, O mighty Democritus, for a new visionary walks amongst us, with views high-minded and ethically handsome, the member for Bigottsville, Pauline Hanson. Ah, Pauline, with your beautiful smile, you've redefined the boundaries of style. With your cat's bum mouth and your eyes that smoulder, you've got a fish and a chip on your shoulder. Yes, Pauline, with your mouth so mean, your fish and chip shop, she looks so clean. You don't like blacks, yellows or Greeks, so why you got roux burgers, dimmies and crab sticks? Ah, Pauline, you're so enlightened. Our system you have heightened. You're so well-dressed, well-versed, well-trained. Xenophobia, please explain. Ah, Pauline, you're heaven sent. Lucky those you represent. Can we join your new age faction? Let's all vote in national action. Pauline's a winner, a shaker, a mover. Pauline's pushing the ethnic hoover. She's cleaning house, this multicultural failure, bringing back shiny white Australia. Pauline, why don't you shut your mouth? You're embarrassing our island in the south. Your voice, it's weak, shallow, shrill. Give up politics, get back on the grill. So I performed that poem all over Australia, and I ended up doing it live on a very famous Australian TV show called Hey Hey It's Saturday. Much against their wishes. They told me I couldn't do it, but the show was going live, so I thought, fuck it, I'll do it anyway. I was then kicked off the property by their security. It was a win for Australian freedom of speech. Chapter 6, 1999, West Papua and witnessing neo-colonialism in the flesh. Good friends of mine from school asked me to come to Papua New Guinea to go hiking. Simon Ellis, a dear friend of mine, me and a couple of mates, Andy and Pete, we went and we hiked across the border into West Papua. I knew nothing about West Papua. It was the most easterly province of Indonesia, but I had never heard of it in Indonesia over 15 years of living there. And we hiked there in the Baliem Valley at 3,000 meters above sea level in this beautiful culture of farmers who lived in beautiful bush material huts. But they spoke the colonial language of Bahasa Indonesia, which I also speak. Selamat pagi. And as we walked around this incredible Neolithic landscape with men wearing penis gourds, with spider webs in their hair to protect from ghosts, we started hearing these terrible stories. It was 99. It was the year that East Timor separated from Indonesia, having their referendum and then their bloody separation from Indonesia. And the locals wanted to know from me in Indonesian why East Timor was getting liberation and Australia, America, the Dutch weren't helping the West Papuans. And I didn't know what they were talking about. And then at night in our hut, these local people would come in and they started telling us these terrible stories of dispossession and of mass murder and of atrocities. And we slowly realized when the penny dropped that we weren't hiking around in some Neolithic tourist paradise, but an undeclared war zone. And it scared the shit out of us. We were unprepared to deal with that reality. And, you know, as we met ordinary people and we heard their personal stories of these terrible things, we joined the dots. And for me, it sort of joined the dots between neo-colonialism, human rights, and fascism. And I didn't know it then, but the die was cast for me because these ideas would become the guiding passions and areas of interest for the rest of my life. We returned to Australia to a deafening silence. West Papua was not in the news, was not in the zeitgeist at all. And I personally, in a sort of an egotistical way, felt angry that I'd been so lied to and that I was such a fool because I knew nothing about this human rights tragedy happening just across the drink to the north of me. So I dived into studying history, West Papua, Indonesia, the Dutch colonial experience. And I realized that it was this Dutch colonial experience was a colonial historical reflection across the shining Arafura Sea, a mirror to Australian history. And it let me see clearly for the first time the relationship between the two. And I realized that British colonialism had done the same thing in Australia. Chapter 7, 2001 to 2004, the Spice Islands and the Yolngu people of Arnhem Land. As I studied Australian history, I learned about the Makassan people, Indonesian seafarers who'd come to Australia for between 600 and 1,000 years. They'd come to Northern Australia to trade with Aboriginal people to get sea slug, the trepang, which was an aphrodisiac for Chinese, and it went through East Timor and ended up back in the Forbidden City. It's incredibly remarkable how far some men will go to get a little lead in the pencil, but they will. And so this trepang trade, this international trade had existed for a long time, and I wanted to make a film about this because I thought it was fascinating. So when a friend of mine, a young man who'd built a catamaran, said that he'd sail us into Indonesia to explore the Makassan story, I jumped on it and we made a film called The Spice Islands Adventure. We sailed through the Maluku province of Indonesia for 8 weeks, and we looked at the colonial history, which is the spice wars, the great race for cloves and nutmeg. We looked at the Dutch colonial experience there and how these tiny islands and the wealth of these spices had turbocharged European colonialism in Indonesia and in fact around the world. When Columbus discovered America, he was looking for a back route to the Spice Islands. And what became apparent to me from that experience of meeting local people on their doorstep and asking permission to be in their place was that protocols, Indigenous protocols, are king in a post-colonial world. In 2004, I got a dream job working with the great Australian writer-director Rolf de Heer, a pioneer, maverick, independent filmmaker. Rolf was about to shoot his multi-award-winning film 10 Canoes in Arnhem Land in Northern Australia, and I convinced him that I should be a part of the crew to live in the swamp for 8 weeks and shoot this film. I worked on the feature film, and I also shot the making of documentary called The Bullender and the Bark Canoe for SBS television. Both films were landmark projects that took cross-cultural filmmaking, film protocols to a whole new post-colonial level. And it was on 10 Canoes that I really learned about Indigenous protocols for the first time. 10 Canoes was the first Australian film shot entirely in Aboriginal language. And watching Rolf work patiently, cross-culturally, respectfully with the Yolngu people, I guess, indoctrinated in me a sense of how this is possible, how you can do this work if you use those attributes. And I've tried really hard since to ingrain all of those ideas into every project that I've worked on. 10 Canoes showed me a beautiful, living, complex, joyful, humour-filled culture of Aboriginal Australia, the Yolngu people. And I fell in love at that point with Aboriginal Australia. Chapter 8 is roughly 2006 to 2009, Melbourne and Strangebirds is the title. Cindy, my partner, and I, we moved from Adelaide to Melbourne in 2004. Then in 2006, out of the blue, a giant jungle carved canoe from West Papua arrived on the northern coast of Australia with 43 West Papuan refugees on board. It was an international incident because these young men and women were given refugee status in Australia. The Indonesian ambassador was recalled from Australia. It was a massive international event of name calling between Australia and Indonesia. And the majority of that 43, as luck would have it, moved to Melbourne. And I, through a few friends, met a whole bunch of these young refugees. And through them and that community, I started meeting the leading West Papuan and Australian political activists in the West Papuan cause. Artists, musicians, political academics, people like Jacob Rumbiak, Irie Ingram, David Bridie, Nick Chesterfield, Jim Elmsley, incredible, intelligent, passionate human rights people. In 2006, that same year, I decided I'd go back to West Papua to turn the little bit of footage that I'd shot the first time around into something that would help the world see this human rights tragedy, this neo-colonial fascist tragedy that was occurring. And so with my great producers, Jamie Nicolai and John Cherry, we put together a little bit of money. No one would finance us. None of the TV stations were interested. And so we privately funded it. And I went back and with Gus Kemp and Troy Schultz, my two cameramen, we shot Strangebirds in Paradise. It premiered at IDFA, the International Documentary Festival in Amsterdam. It was nominated in the Australian Academy Awards for numerous prizes. It's screened on Australian television many times. Its last big public screening was a few months ago at the end of last year in Cambridge Museum. So it's done the rounds. I was, after the release of the film, pretty much persona non grata in Indonesia. I didn't travel back to Indonesia for 5 years. And the film is a true post-colonial story of white Australians and black West Papuans working together to tell a story of colonial brutality and of dispossession. I'm not going to go into any more detail on Strangebirds right now, as I'm still living in Indonesia and the film is banned here, and I don't want to upset my hosts any more than I already have. And I want to keep this wonderful experience of my children being at the Green School going for another half a year, if possible. Chapter 9 is 2000 to 2014, Motorkite Dreaming into the heart of Australia. I'd always wanted to create something that would take average Australians, working class, middle class Australians, into Black Australia, to show the humour, the strength, the genius, the complexity of Aboriginal Australia to everyday people who wouldn't normally engage in that sort of story or that culture. So when Aidan Glasby, the young skipper from Spice Islands, called me and he said he wanted to fly these tiny microlights across Australia, I immediately said yes. 10 Canoes, as I have expressed, taught me that Indigenous protocols are king. And this crazy idea of these microlights meant travelling through 20 Aboriginal language nations across the whole of Australia. A protocols puzzle at best and pretty much a nightmare at worst. Indigenous Australia, excuse me for a sec. Indigenous Australia and Indigenous Australians have been some of the most studied, examined and portrayed peoples on earth. From the early 1900s, many of the 500 language nations became the focus of intense academic and filmic study all over the world. From Sigmund Freud to Crocodile Dundee, the world's oldest living culture was the fascination of the world, this ancient, inscrutable, enduring culture. Ironically, this global exposure, which took place at that time, and it took place at the same time as these people were dispossessed, mass murdered, and that experience purposefully hidden from view. Ironic and tragic, yeah? Aboriginal Australians were rarely asked permission or involved in the strategies that documented or portrayed them until very recently. Film and TV crews would just rock up at an Indigenous community, poke a camera in someone's face without so much as saying good morning. Press click. Foreign and local film crews quite often told very sacred and secret stories. They filmed and exposed protected and secret ceremonies and sacred places that should never have been filmed and never shared with anybody outside of those who are initiated to see that material. And they shared that material with domestic and global audiences. So I wanted to make a post-colonial film that respected and included Aboriginal nations, the nations that we plan to visit. Knowing how complex the protocols would be, I started the process a full 2 years before we took on the adventure. And I knew that the sheer scale and the tough, multifaceted environment would mean that I couldn't achieve this on my own. So I reached out to an old friend of mine, Carol Carpeney, a Ngarrindjeri Aboriginal man from South Australia who I'd worked with on theatre and music projects in the past, and asked him to come on board. Carol's an incredibly experienced cultural practitioner, 40-year career in rock music, Aboriginal culture, and through that he had the connections to weave together this intricate web of Aboriginal elders and nations. So together we reached out to, oh, that's just my son jumping on the bed. How you going, Jack? Yeah. So together we reached out to Aboriginal leaders in all the 20 Aboriginal nations through phone, email, the grapevine. And 6 months later, we set off on a protocols journey. Myself, my producer, John Cherry, our two pilots of the microlights, Aidan and Daryl, were led by our protocols directors, Carol Carpeney and his best mate, Bart Sansbury. We drove 2 full drives, 4,000 kilometres from Adelaide to Broome, across the entire proposed flight route for Motorkite Dreaming. In many of these remote desert communities in the middle of nowhere, we'd made prior contact and had, and these elders and leaders were expecting us to arrive. But in many cases, we just arrive in these tiny communities without introduction, in which case Carol would talk to the elders, would sit down with elders and leaders in each of those language nations, introduce ourselves, ask permission to drive through the country at that time, explain the concept of Motorkite Dreaming, the film, and then ask permission to come back the following year to shoot Motorkite Dreaming, the TV series and film. And overwhelmingly, we were greeted with incredible enthusiasm. That small iota of respect paid off with full blessings and incredible access. So we drove that whole proposed route, 4,000 kilometres in 3 weeks, doing protocols, asking permission, and it worked a charm. Okay, thanks. The making of Motorkite Dreaming, for me, it felt like the pieces were slowly falling into place. I felt like I'd found my thing, you know, and storytelling with filmmaking, and through it, I was starting to understand my country, myself inside that country as a white man in a colonised black country. And I was starting to understand Australia's crazy, wild journey from the colonial to the now, from slavery and fascism to the modern world. Now, a huge part of getting a grip on this experience was my post-colonial reading. I started reading everything I could get my hands on. From the 1940s, I dived into the genius of the post-colonial authors that emerged out of the World War II chaos, the poets of negritude, César, Fanon, Albert Memmi, Senghor, Dumas. César had sort of coined the idea that Nazism and European fascism was birthed from the poison of racism and slavery and the atrocities of colonialism, that they were the same. He said that the chickens of that poisoned well had come home to roost in Europe. So I studied the writings and the actions of Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, the Black Panthers, Nelson Mandela. And then I read from James Baldwin right through to Ta-Nehisi Coates and his wonderful essay, Between the World and Me, from a few years ago. And I'm still fascinated with the Black American struggle, American art and music as a tool of political struggle, the blues, hip hop, post-colonial films. Their incredible eloquence, that genius, the explanation of political struggle that really lit my way. So as we prepared to film Motorkite Dreaming, I delved again into Australian history, and because I knew this was my chance to make a post-colonial film, and I wanted to dig deep into to know what had happened here in Australia. And through that reading, I discovered the Frontier Wars, you know, the great war war for Australia between 1788 and roughly 1860. This guerrilla conflict, this ongoing conflict of dispossession, an undeclared war, of mass murder, of rape, of dispossession, of mass internment. I learned that the English didn't arrive in Australia as an innocent, open-minded settler class. They had formed, they'd sharpened their swords in India and America. They'd perfected dispossession, mass murder, and they knew how to cover it up and how to demonize those they depossessed. I learned that Australia was founded on a white supremacist ideology, the White Australia policy. The first piece of law that the Australian Federation passed was the White Australia policy, which tried to get rid of Black Australia, get rid of Asian Australia, and turn us all into a homogenised white state. And from the 1920s to the 1960s, we interned and assimilated Aborigines. We interned them in missions and reserves. We stole children from their parents and tried to breed the black out of Australia. It didn't work. Black Australia was much too powerful, much too resilient for that. But the White Australia policy gave it a good shot. And the White Australia policy lasted right into the 1970s. Luckily, in the 1960s, there was this global explosion of consciousness around the world. It's human rights and liberation consciousness, and that came to Australia in the form of the 1966 Wave Hill walkouts, where Aboriginal workers walked off the land, off cattle properties, demanding land rights, demanding pay from a culture of slavery. Then in 1967, we held a referendum where we finally, white Australia voted to recognise Aboriginal Australians as citizens, not just as flora and fauna, but as citizens. And they were allowed to vote in their own country for the first time. The dismantling of the White Australia policy took place, and the last vestiges of that terrible policy were removed in about 1975 by Gough Whitlam and then Malcolm Fraser. In the 1980s and the 1990s, New Australia began to flourish, multicultural, embracing refugees, Aboriginal land rights, political power, minority power. And I learned about the Aboriginal struggle art forms, particularly music, bands like Us Mob, No Fixed Address, the Warumpi Band, Coloured Stones, Yothu Yindi, Archie Roach, all of these incredible, struggling Aboriginal political activists who lit the way for where we find ourselves today. And all this new knowledge I poured into a hat and put that hat on as I set up to shoot Motorkite Dreaming in July of 2014. Just checking the time there. So in 2014, I got together the crew of the Spice Islands adventure, Benny Brooks, Aidan Glasby, and we put Jamie Nicolai and John Cherry, our producers. And in order to do obviously the culture and protocols, our protocols directors, Carol Carpeney and Bart Sansbury. And we set off on our 10-week journey from South Australia through the Northern Territory to Western Australia. My crew in 3 cars, chasing the pilots' wives in their car as they chased the 2 crazy flying fools in their tiny flying machines on their very long and very dangerous journey from the far south to the far north. In many ways, the rigorous protocols process for Motorkite Dreaming not only allowed the smooth creation of the film, but it defined the spirit and the great success of the project as a whole. Even in post-production, when we're editing the film and the TV series, Carol Carpeney kept working with me, checking cultural information in the film, maintaining contact with Aboriginal elders, informing them of our progress and our plans for the film's release. The film, Motorkite Dreaming, the feature doc, played in cinemas across Australia, and the TV series is still playing on Australian television and at redbull.tv. You can just go and watch it for free, 5-part TV series there. The intensive protocols of that experience allowed us complete and beautiful access to the culture and the spectacular locations. And audiences around Australia and I think around the world have been blown away and deeply moved by that access, which is a tribute to the hard work we did in that post-colonial process, cultural protocols process. Excuse me. So filmmaking and travel and friends, all of these aspects have led me into this rich world where the view of Australia is deep and sometimes disturbing, but it's also rich and vibrant and beautiful. So what have I learned from that whole journey? What I've learned about myself and about Australia is that we Australians live in a ahistorical culture, a society that doesn't know its own history, a society that spent 150 years of its infancy hiding and denying the events of the colonial invasion. I learnt of a myriad of sad old white men like our tragic and dangerous one-time Prime Minister John Howard, the punch-drunk idiot man-child Tony Abbott, and the now zealous evangelical Prime Minister Scott Morrison, who have spent their precious time trying to gild this cluster-fucked lily of whitewashed history. But despite their flaccid protests, we know that Australia was invaded by white British colonials, and yet it's still difficult and sometimes impossible to use the I word, the invasion word, in polite beer drinking company. I learnt that these events, these bloody events, so thoroughly un-Christian and so illegal, that in order to keep the illusion of moral authority, they had to be buried deep and denied. So not only did subsequent generations of white Australians embrace this childish convenience, but they embellished the bullshit to the point where invaders and dispossessors became no more than settlers and nation builders. It got so bad and it worked so well that in 1901, the great men of Australia decided to form a federation based on the only thing the states could agree on, a white supremacist exclusion policy, the White Australia policy. Denial leads to delusion, and it led these fucktards to believe they could create a pure white nation here in Australasia, on this black continent. As deluded as clearly this may seem, and it sounds, it turned out to be the most effective racial engineering policy in the world, kicking out Asians and coloured communities for half a century and driving Aboriginal societies into the ground, so that by the late 1950s, Australia was well over 80% vanilla. Incredible. Thank goodness, the 1960s saw this explosion of national consciousness. It flowed from the civil rights movements in Europe and America, and the remnants of the repugnant White Australia policy were finally expunged from Australia and Australian law in the late 1970s. Those laws have changed, but the effect on the Australian national psyche of 60 years of this white supremacist law and hate rhetoric remains deeply inculcated and subtly entrenched in the background noise of Australian politics, in our social debate, in our cultural life. So I think the great lesson for me in this is that in a nation of people from other places with distinct gene pools, lost and forgotten, half-forgotten cultures, Aboriginal Australia is still remarkably offering us a new, modern, mixed identity, a new home, a new mixed culture, and a new sense of who we are. Unique, ancient, but new, all at once. And if we are happy to respect their culture, they are happy to share it with us. Clearly, these are all tough lessons, but they forced me to grow up culturally and intellectually and to face the truth of my country and myself inside that nation, which brings us to today, to now, and my latest and hopefully greatest post-colonial projects, and the final chapter of this little presentation, chapter 10, Bali, comic books and feature films. In 2017, a year after Motorkite Dreaming came out, I moved to Bali with my family. Cindy and I wanted to give our kids a multicultural, bilingual experience, and we moved them to green school while they were young, and so it would sink in deeply into their tiny little roots. I've made a couple of small films while I've been here, but nothing as life-changing as Motorkite Dreaming. Living here has given me the opportunity to reflect. And as much as I love documentary making and the power of documentary, I can also see its limitations in Australia. The fact that my screenings on television and in festivals and cinemas always seem to be preaching to the choir, singing to the converted, useful, but never really impacting in the way that I wanted them to. So now I'm trying a few new approaches. I'm mixing up the mediums to try and create a new voice for a new audience. The first of these projects is called Crime Scene Australia, It's a 40-page revisionist history comic book. It tells the story of a Sydney-based Aussie TV crew shooting an investigative cold case TV series about historical Aboriginal war and colonial massacre sites. And it quickly descends into a murderous and terrifying ghost story. So I'm mixing the mediums there. My artists, Michael Kumnick, Hedy Ibrahim, and myself want Crime Scene Australia to be the most controversial comic book in Australian publishing, the first Australian graphic novel with Indigenous protocols and a big slice of post-colonial truth. A new medium targeted at a new audience. So while the godbotherers and prudes have banned movies, they've burnt books, they've even tried to burn people, the humble comic book, the graphic novel, has flown under the radar, and like the Poms in Australia, can maybe get away with murder. We'll see. In short, we're aiming to produce a kick-ass publication that sparks interest in and a conversation in the true history of colonial Australia. So stay tuned for Crime Scene Australia. I've just pre-published 10 pages of that comic book on Facebook. Michael and Hedy and I are finishing the ink work. It will be a digital comic book online in a few months. Crime Scene Australia. Finally, my most exciting project yet is a dramatic feature film. A project that has been made possible by all the lessons learnt across this cross-cultural work, the cross-cultural protocols they demanded, and the 40-year-long search that I've had for this post-colonial identity. It's called Jungle of Ghosts. It's a modest budget foreign language thriller to be shot in Papua New Guinea next year. It's a fiction based entirely on true stories, a journey from the tough streets of Lae, the city streets, into the wild jungles of Papua New Guinea. Hopefully darkly humorous, culturally rich, shocking, revealing journey that shows the beauty of Papua New Guinea and the dramatic plight of West Papua. Jungle of Ghosts is the first Papua New Guinean language film, Tok Pisin feature film. The first time a film's been made there fully in Papuan language. A post-colonial drama showcases modern and traditional cultures, mythology, breathtaking landscapes from the coast to the jungle. My producer, Adam Wright, and I are pouring all of our energy and our hearts into making something amazing. We start shooting in Papua New Guinea in early 21. We've got a distributor, an Australian distributor. We've got most of the budget. We still need more investors, but we're super excited about Jungle of Ghosts. Tea. Drink tea. Always drink tea. So, ladies and gents, in conclusion, from a confused little white boy, perplexed by this ahistorical whitewashed culture, I've travelled pretty far and wide to arrive at my sense of identity, shaped by better knowing my home and thereby myself. Now, in 2020, in isolation, I identify as a husband, for want of a better word, to my partner, Cindy. We've been together for 20 years, and she pretty much guides our ship of state through these tumultuous seas. I identify as a father to Ariel and Jack, who in many ways really define the limits of what's possible, beautiful, difficult in life. I identify as a modern Australian, a white man in a black country with a complicated history that's not always black and white, and a place that's still revealing itself to me. I identify, again, as a modern Australian. I think a modern Australian, what I mean by that is I identify by my friends, the friends I have in white Australia, black Australia, New Zealand, Papua New Guinea, Indonesia. This is my region. These are our cultures. These are our people. This is my identity. My parents had none of these relationships. As generous and open-hearted as they were, they had none of these relationships or connections. But my kids take these friendships and these relationships for granted. clearly identity is not stationary. It's a shifting story. It's a movable feast, not a fixed thing. So I think my sense of self and home is going to keep evolving as I keep traveling, meeting people in Australia, Papua, Indonesia, and I keep learning about my neck of the woods, about my region. The good, the bad, the beautiful, the horrific, the struggle. It's a very deep well to draw from. So as a coder, I would say, know your history, know your story, know thyself. That's it for now. Thanks for hearing me. If anyone wants to see any of my films, drop me a line. If you want to talk about Crime Scene Australia or Jungle of Ghosts, drop me a line. If anyone's got any questions, let's hear them.
Well, that's great. Well, Charlie, thank you. How can you not like a presentation that so seamlessly mixes fucking Nazis with a little lead in the pencil comment and a slew of other comments that are going on there. So anyways, I've seen Charlie's film, his documentary that he's done that he was referencing earlier. It's phenomenal. His work is incredible as a storyteller, and I love the honesty that you always bring to these discussions, Charlie, but you weave in historical context. You help us to connect the dots on so many of these pieces. So thank you so much for doing that. So we do have a little bit of time for a few questions. So if you do have a question, just feel free to unmute and fire away. Joe, go ahead.
Hi, Charlie.
Hey.
Everything you're saying applies so much to Canada as well. Like just that, and I didn't meet an Indigenous person until I was in my 20s as well. And I'm finding myself thinking there's always the extreme kind of neo-Nazi people that get a lot of kind of platform in some ways in the media as being the worst thing ever. But it seems kind of crazy that all these years and decades go by and it's still the same. They're still invisible and they're still being, and I was just wondering, do you think there's something about kind of left-leaning collective that are outraged about how they're treated, but there's something that we're doing collectively that enables it to all continue? Like,
yeah,
are we part of the problem in our patting ourselves on the back?
Yeah, it's really difficult, isn't it? And we clearly are. The sort of the self-congratulating bourgeoisie, comfortable and content, is really a block to progress. Perhaps we've educated ourselves, we feel enlightened in some way, we feel post-colonial in some way, but there's no action. There's a quiet, contented inaction, a passivity that allows these strong, extreme voices to be heard, but not the voice of perhaps a majority who have come around to respecting Indigenous culture, but are inactive. And part of the difficulty is we don't know what to do. We don't know how to address these issues. The starting point is engagement. And until you know your history, you can't sit at a table equally with Indigenous people because they know their history. They know what happened. And until you've read that and ingested that, you're not at an equal beginning place for a conversation. So that's what we can all do, is we can educate ourselves, get to an equal place to begin a conversation. And when you do that, I think your level of emotional engagement with the story will push you off your comfortable ass to do something.
Because I would say just one more thing. When you see what has been accomplished in a period of weeks around the globe right now, it seems like if we wanted to, anything's possible. You could be ending everything, like world hunger, all. If we can shut down the world like we've done, then it just makes me, it makes me feel like we're, and maybe it comes through education, like how the lack of resilience and that's educated into us, that we have to be great and achieve, and to actually acknowledge that we might come from the most horrendous ancestors of genocide. And I mean, I guess I come from Nazis and colonialists. And
it's a pretty dance, isn't it?
Charlie, do you think, it's an extension, Jamie here, as an extension, as an extension of that, it's the far left and the far right, which has perhaps the loudest voice today, but perhaps that's always been true to a certain extent. You know, the greatest criminals, the greatest, you know, people that have visited these atrocities upon Indigenous nations all over the world. I mean, guns, germs, and stills, and you know, the need to conquer, and the need to you know, enslave a population to a certain extent. But it's that far left and that far right voice now that I hear most dominantly, and I just wonder if that's always existed like that.
Well, especially with the bourgeoisie, you know, the middle class, you know, which is an easier term. You know, that middle class is inactive, and whilst they are so, then I guess those voices from the two extremities are going to dominate the debate. And you know, this has been the thrust of these last many years for me, is trying to create storytelling media that focuses on that middle class, and you know, that's what we tried to do with Strangebirds, and that's what we tried to do with Motorkite Dreaming, but. And even though they had some success, they still ended up preaching to the choir and not really getting into that sweet spot of the mainstream, which is where we wanted them to go, which is always what we talked about, Jim. And that's why I'm now making a feature film, because this is the most accessible media. You know, feature dramatic films get you below your level of awareness. You know, before you know it, you've been inculcated with all these radical political ideas. And you just thought you were watching an adventurous thriller. So that's very much the aim of the game now. And for all of us, you know, how can we educate ourselves and then help our brethren to do the same? Because when you are educated, you feel emotional about this stuff, and you're less likely to do nothing about it.
Hey guys.
Hey Benny.
Charlie, just on one positive thing that I worked on recently, the ABC Kids series called Are You Tougher Than Your Ancestors?
Yeah.
And it's a 10-part, you know, kids sort of series where it's sort of 2 kids in each episode, and they basically swap clothes and live a day in the life of, you know, their ancestors. And of the 10 episodes, we did one, we were supposed to do 2 Indigenous episodes. One we did up in Parawira with the Ghana people, the local Ghana mob. And we were looking at some games, kids games, Pandu and Mukara, which are sort of like, you know, the possum skin, you know, Australian football, and some throwing games. And that little exercise working with the Ghana people there was just really amazing and special. And there was good protocols done there. And, you know, that will go to air, I think, on the 15th of June.
Great.
But it's definitely something to look into. And especially with the kids, having some positive, you know, things to connect to Indigenous Australia, I think is so important, because there's so much to celebrate and to share with not only our family and friends when we travel overseas or we meet people from other places. We can actually go, hey, what's it like to be Australian? It's, well, actually, this is what's great about it. We live with this incredible culture, and not only in a beautiful place. So the Ghana, that episode with the Ghana was great, but interestingly enough, we were going to do a piece on the Naui canoes in Sydney Harbour, which got basically canned through the protocol process, which wasn't done correctly. And yeah, it was just an interesting place to be where, telling stories of Indigenous people is so important to have the right groups together and they can agree on being able to share that information, because as we all know, there's many people who want to share information. There's a lot of people who don't, and that's fair enough, because it has been ripped and torn away from communities and families, and are still very unhappy about it.
And it's a complicated process. It's never easy. It's never a straight line. It takes a lot of patience, listening, and hard work to do complicated protocols. But it's a thoroughly educating experience.
Yeah.
As you have experienced, Ben, in your work.
That's great. Any more questions for Charlie?
What is your favourite colour?
Puce.
I would have guessed it.
Yeah.
All right. Charlie, thank you so much for coming on the call and just sharing. And Benny, maybe you could put your TV series, just put that up in the chat so people can see that as well too. That'd be great. Great.
I think it's
have that as a reference if you just click on chat and then just add it in there. But thank you so much for that, Charlie. And it's good to know you're just engaging on Zoom as you are on face-to-face. And it's going to be great kind of seeing how your new documentary unfolds. And as you know, I've been following it very, very closely, the work that you're doing with Adam. And I can't wait to see how that comes out, and what that culminates in with all your work and your emotions. And I think it's going to be a brilliant piece, and hopefully we can perhaps feature it at Green School in a premiere showing if possible. So that would be great.
We'll see about that. Yeah.
As we know. Anyways, but thank you guys, and thank you all for coming on to the call today. And nice having Carol all the way awake at 1 o'clock in the morning in Brazil and people around. So everybody have a great day. Take care, and we'll see you around. Okay. Thanks, guys.
Ciao.
Go to Green School.